Oh, is it up? Is it up? Yes, it's up. All right. Sorry for the delay, but sometimes we get on tangents before we've even started. We have to try and break that habit and save the tangents for the class time. All right. So we are picking up with the very end of chapter 6. I say the very end with slight hesitation because it's a very long last Mishnah of chapter 6. As you can see, it's divided into 2 pages on this particular translation. Because it's covering a very large discussion. This is another example of what the back and forth of dialogue can look like among the rabbis. Again, if you want to see more and more of this, that's called Talmud study. But this will give you a little more taste of how, when you have different opinions, how they get cross-referenced and interpreted back and forth. So with that in mind, do we have our volunteer reader back? Okay, we do. So we are on Eduyot, Chapter 6, Mishnah 3, what's labeled as Part 1 in our packet. Everyone see where we are? Now you got to pay attention here because this is going to be confusing. We're going to have names that matter. It's not just Rabbi so-and-so and we ignore him. We need to remember the names, okay?
We never ignore anyone, especially the rabbis.
And yet, I make you bet a lot of times which particular rabbi said what, whoop, drops out. Here we're going to see why remembering who said what makes a difference.
And is this something that would cause a person to be impure? Is that what we're talking about?
So we're talking about ritual purity or impurity again.
Okay.
And in this particular case, we're talking about bits of people. Remember, we talked about an amputated limb in the last week's session, and we've talked about other things that can contract impurity from corpses and things like that. Well, here we're talking about removing of minute quantities, the minimum amount that could or could not then become a transmitter of ritual impurity. And we're going to be talking about things that are olive size or barley grain size. These are 2 measurements from the ancient world. So just think of, the size of an olive, right? And, about like that, regular size olive, not those stupid fat jumbo olives. And think about a barley grain as being a tiny little speck level of material. We good?
Olive and a mustard seed, or
probably a little bigger than a mustard seed. Yeah.
Like a grain of rice.
Yeah, grain of rice is about right. Maybe a little smaller, depending upon how big of rice you get. Those long grain and
Okay.
Well, this is rice. Right. This is why we eventually end up with things like grams, because this measurement is a little rough.
Yes.
Okay. So, ready?
An olive's quantity of flesh severed from the limb of a living man.
Okay. So we've got an olive's worth. Someone took a melon baller and just went, right, and pulled out a chunk of a person. Oh. Right? Yeah, it's not nice, right? But think of it not as being a deliberate torture, but think of it instead as someone who is sawing on their wood and their finger, whoop, and they take off part of the finger.
What's leprosy?
The leprosy. Oh, where the diseased parts of the body falls off. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the body can lose skin or pieces because of diseases as well. So yeah, there's lots of ways to lose bits of your creative here. Lots of ways to lose bits of your flesh. Not many of them are nice. So the question is, what do we consider with what's going on here?
This is an olive's quantity. Rabbi Eliezer pronounces it impure, and Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Nahuna pronounce pure.
All right, so let's make sure we got this. For the olive-sized piece of flesh, right? We've got impure and we've got pure. Okay, so who are our folks? Repeat it back to me, right? Eliezer and
Joshua.
Joshua
And
Nahuniah.
I never heard about
Never
Nehemiah
heard
because
of
I
it
know
before,
that
yeah.
Eliezer and Yeshua were one
They get a lot.
five.
Yeah, they get a lot more
biggest
screen
one.
time. Yes. Okay. Well, now you know him. All right. So
But same generation, Nehemiah.
because they're going to be talking. So olive size. What does Eliezer say? Can that make you pure or impure?
Impure.
Impure.
Joshua?
Pure.
Nahuniah?
Pure.
Okay.
2 to 1.
2 to 1.
2 to 1.
Okay. But hold on, because we're not done yet. Next piece.
A barley grain's quantity of bone severed from the limb of a living man. Nehemiah pronounces it impure, and Eliezer and Joshua pronounce it pure.
Switch.
Interesting.
Okay. Eliezer, Joshua, Nehemiah.
But which one is bigger, the olive or the barley?
The olive is bigger.
Olive is
The
bigger.
olive is bigger. Okay, but this is, remember, this is bone now, right? This is skin or flesh,
Flesh.
right?
Right.
Could be any flesh, but non-bone, and this is bone. Okay, so what does Eliezer say? Barley-sized piece of bone.
Eliezer,
Pure.
pure.
Yeah.
Pure. Eliezer says pure.
Yes, pure. And what does Joshua say?
Pure.
Pure.
And Nehemiah?
Impure.
Okay,
Olive is bigger. Right?
the olive is
Yeah.
bigger. Okay, so without looking further along through the Mishnah, what would you notice about these two charts?
Yeah.
The only consistent is Joshua.
Okay, so
Yeah.
first of all, we've got Joshua who says it's pure, we're fine,
Yeah.
right? So he says pure about everything. What do we notice about Eliezer?
Impure.
He reverses, right? He says the olive size makes you impure, right? But he says the bone, but the bone size piece, barley size piece of bone, doesn't make you pure. Sorry, it does not render things impure, right? It's considered stays pure. And Nehemiah, he's the opposite, right? The olive size is something that can still say be not rendered impure, but the barley piece of bone that can render something impure. So we've got same and reversed, but larger yes, smaller no, larger no, smaller yes.
So
So we've got three different opinions that are, one's consistent in quotes, and then two others that seem to be inconsistent.
Actually, no. Actually, Eliezer is consistent also.
Who is?
Eliezer is consistent because the bigger one is impure. Now the smaller one is not impure. Is pure.
So the question,
So Eliezer
so
also is consistent.
there is an explanation, as Natan is trying to give us, of how Eliezer might be considered consistent, but that means really what we're trying to ask is, are they consistent or not? Right? Is Eliezer really consistent? Is Nehemiah really consistent? Even though we may think that the only measure should be size, remember, this is flesh, this is bone. Does the material make a difference? Is it only the size that matters, or does the material matter? So with that in mind, I'm not going to expect you to know this off the top of your head. Let's see how this Mishnah unpacks the apparent inconsistencies and what we are able to do with that. Okay, so
Number two.
true.
They say to Rabbi Eliezer, what reason have you found for pronouncing impure an olive's quantity of flesh severed from a limb of a living man?
All right,
What
so
reason?
justify yourself why, if I, cut off someone's ear, that ear is considered something that can transmit ritual impurity.
And Rabbi Eliezer said to them, we find that a limb from a living man is like an entire corpse, just as in the case of a corpse, an olive's quantity of flesh severed from the corpse is impure. So also in the case of the limb from a living man, an olive's quantity of flesh severed from him must be impure.
Okay, so if I have a dead body and I cut off the limb is still ritually impure, right? We're all good on that. But if I were to remove an olive's quantity of flesh from the dead body, it is also impure, right? So full body, limb of the body, olive's piece of the body, impure, 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 right? So his position is, if the limb of a living person is also
but what did he said for the living?
Yeah,
Not from
both
the-
of them is that
not
he
from
didn't
the
say
core.
dead in this part at all.
It's from living.
A
not from
living
the core.
man,
is like an entire corpse. Sorry.
No, but he
Just-
said the flesh is separate from an organ of the living.
in
not
other words,
from-
if you cut off somebody's leg,
Right, but no,
a
but it's
living person,
yeah,
they're going to consider the leg a corpse.
correct.
Okay,
no,
but he's
not,
making-
not from the core itself. Not like, for
But not the
example,
corpse.
you take a part from the core
That's
that
different.
was impure.
right, but he's making an analogy,
Right.
right? And the analogy is to the corpse, right? So the analogy is, if I have a living person and I cut off his arm has the same impurity as a dead body,
Oh, okay.
right?
Yeah.
So the dead body and the arm from the living person, those are the same. In the same way, just as in the case of the corpse as well, an olive's quantity of flesh severed from it is impure. If I have a dead body and I take off an olive piece, it's impure. It should follow the same pattern as what happens when you remove the arm, right? So his argument is, if the arm from a living person follows the same pattern as a corpse, and the olive from a dead person is also impure, then the olive from a living person should also be impure, right? He's trying to follow the pattern of, if it works for a dead body and for a limb, it should work for the dead body and for the olive piece.
It's not kind of kalvachomer.
Kind of, yeah. But I mean, it's not necessarily a kal v'chomer because the limb is larger than the olive. So you might think that maybe there's a certain quantity that it disappears on. But he's trying to argue that if it doesn't disappear with a body, then it shouldn't disappear with a living person either, right? If a piece from a body is also impure, then the piece of a living person should follow the same pattern. However, the sages, the general opinion is going to push back on him.
They said to him, no.
Okay, now here, it's very important to understand this. They are not saying no to his conclusion. They're saying no to his explanation. That's not the reason you're saying it. And they're going to tell him that his reason is incorrect because it's inconsistent because of our chart. So let's see if we can follow their logic.
When you pronounce impure an olive's quantity of flesh severed from a corpse, it is because you have pronounced impure a barley grain's quantity of bone severed from it. But how can
Okay, we're going to do this in pieces.
Oh,
Sorry, in pieces.
Pronounced
Because we're talking about pieces. That wasn't intentional. That's the best kind of pun. Okay, so let's take care of this first piece here, right? When you pronounce an olive impure, an olive's quantity of flesh severed from a corpse, it's because you have pronounced impure a barley grain's quantity of bone. So what he said, what the rabbis are saying here is that if you're going to justify the olive piece, you're doing so because of the embedded piece of bone in the olive piece, right? It is the bone that is impure, and the olive piece of flesh is just going with it, right? And therefore, the real issue is, what do we say about the bone? But of course, what does he say about the bone?
Oh, his bone is pure.
It's pure. So therefore, that doesn't work, right? So that's where we get to the second half of their response.
So how can you also pronounce impure an olive's quantity of flesh severed from the limb of a living man, seeing you pronounce pure a barley grain's quantity of bone severed from it?
Right? So it's inconsistent. If you're trying to say the flesh is impure, then you have to base that on the idea that the bone is impure, but you don't say the bone is impure, so therefore it is illogical for you to say that the flesh is impure. And don't give me any of this nonsense about, the skin of the body and the butt of it, the corpse. That's not the real system. The real system is if bone, then flesh. But you said different for the bone. That's their rebuttal. Now, we're going to see that.
So maybe because the rabbi go by the material and he goes by the size.
Perhaps, but we have to make the decision of what we're going by. And they're arguing for him. He wasn't arguing by size, remember? He didn't argue by size. He argued by origin. That if the limb from a living was similar to the limb from a corpse, then the olive from a living should be similar to the olive from a corpse. He didn't talk about size. It's just same source, same ruling. And the rabbis are saying that is an inadequate justification. You could justify it based upon the bone position, but your bone position contradicts this. So therefore, we're not buying it. All right. But Rabbi Nehunya is sitting over in the corner going, they got him. And now it's his turn.
They said to Rabbi Nehunya, what reason have you found for pronouncing impure a barley grain's quantity of bone severed from a limb of a living man?
All right. So they go down here and they say, wait a minute. You said that barley corn piece of bone was impure. Why do you say that? What's your justification?
He said to them, we find that a limb from a living man is like an entire corpse. Just as in the case of a corpse, a barley grain's quantity of bone severed from it is impure, so also in the case of a limb from a living man, a barley grain's quantity of bone severed from it must be impure.
Does that sound familiar?
So he's using the same argument that the rabbis.
Exactly. He's using the exact same argument from Eliezer, but he's talking about the bone piece rather than the flesh piece. And notice what that allows him to do. It allows him to say the bone is impure, but it gets him into trouble when he's up here.
Yeah.
Right? Both of them choose one part to focus on, but their answer does not justify the entire division of their opinions. Right? If they both said impure, or impure and impure, then that could work. But they don't both say that. They both have one place where they disagree with pure or impure, and that means this apparent justification is inadequate. Make sense? We see how this is sort of falling apart for each of them trying to explain their position. That means the rabbis are going to say, this is what you must have meant, and you're still wrong.
Yeah, because they said to him, no, when you pronounce impure, a barley grain's quantity of bone severed from a corpse, it is because you have pronounced impure an olive's quantity of flesh severed from it. But how can you also pronounce impure a barley grain's quantity of bone severed from the limb of a living man, seeing that you pronounce pure an olive's quantity of flesh severed from it?
They're saying it's a two-way street, right? Whatever you say for one, you need to say for the other. They're based upon each other, right? They are connected, and therefore saying yay and nay, or nay or yay and nay doesn't work. That's the rabbi is trying to explain that to the two opinions. Make sense? Maybe we're not done yet, but yeah.
That's funny. It seems like this is one of the few places in the Mishnah where they actually discuss the reasoning.
Absolutely.
And I know they have. Are they trying to bring out what the actual rule is, or are they trying to bring out the reasoning? Because that's
the reasoning, right? So
right.
I mean,
would that be consistent with? Because I know they talk about I think at this time, what was it? This harmonic principles that were used.
Hermeneutic, right?
Hermeneutic that was used.
Second time I got to use that word today.
Yeah. Twice in one day.
I know. I go months without saying hermeneutical, and then I get to say it twice.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, the idea is that the Talmud in particular is very much interested in looking at the underlying principles of why the different sages have their different opinions or application of the different opinions. And this is a tiny window into that process. But here, the goal is not to reconcile. The goal is to simply expose. Right? In the Talmud, they'll usually try to harmonize opinions, get a little passionate. But here, they're actually trying to say, that's not right, to begin to get us into the idea of how we analyze these opinions. But since that's not the Mishnah's main job, we are not going to be doing that all the time.
I was going to say, because I think it was last week we brought out Rabbi Meir. Some of his opinions were stricken because people said he was
too subtle,
too much of an orator. And I said, well, if there's something wrong with his reasoning, that's just bad logic, though.
Right, but if I can't identify the mistake, that doesn't mean I have to be forced to go with his conclusion. Let me give you like some bad example because I can't remember all the details. But does anybody here remember Abbott and Costello?
Yeah.
Right. The comedy team, right? And there was a great bit. I know their most famous part was who's on first, right?
Yeah.
But they did another bit.
Because I don't play baseball.
Right.
So, but there's another bit that they did, another sketch that had to do with how do you bake enough to serve everybody. And Costello, the shorter guy, does the math on the board, but he does it so fast that he slips in some twists. And it sounds like it makes sense, right? He's very convincing. It's like, yeah, boom, 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 there. Now we got enough. It's like, what? No, but it can't be. They can't serve that many people from that little food. But he said it very convincingly, and he had math to prove it. And if you couldn't follow it, especially like in the old days of the movie where you couldn't hit pause, and it was just gone, that doesn't mean you have to agree with him. Just because someone blinds you with their logic and you can't spot the logical fallacy doesn't mean you have to go along with what they said. And that is a very important principle in Jewish thinking, is you may sound right, but that doesn't mean you are right until we've had a chance to really break it apart and debrief it. And if I can't follow your logic, I can't follow your ruling, right? It's the obligation of the teacher to make sure that the student can understand all of the points. And if the teacher doesn't do that, then I'm under no compulsion to follow your ruling.
Yeah, but the burden's on the proponent making the argument, and
Always.
And it'll be under the scrutiny of, something like this seems like it'd be under the scrutiny of 30, 40 people.
Well, yes, but that doesn't mean, and Rabbi Meir was so brilliant that even the other sages of his generation weren't able to keep up with them all the time. And so they needed help. And in fact, he did write most of the Mishnah. The tradition is that any part of the Mishnah that doesn't have a name attached to it, that's Rabbi Meir.
But
Right? All of the anonymous Mishnah, that's Rabbi Meir.
the main thing I was going to say is because, I mean, they were familiar with Aristotelian logic, right? Which
Of course.
would have been only 300 years earlier.
Yeah, well, I mean, well, it was widespread by that point.
Right.
Yes, but Aristotelian logic only takes you so far, right? Because you still need to work out your basic principles and axioms prior to putting it into a logic square. So that was what the Torah exegesis process was. Trying to understand what the Torah wanted gave me the building blocks, and then I can plug it into a logic system. But getting those building blocks,
Yeah.
that's what's going on here.
And that's actually one of the main attacks people make on arguments is they attack the
The assumptions.
assumptions
The
which it's
premise.
based on, the
Yeah.
premises.
That's always the best place to attack, because if the logic is good, then the only flaw can be in the premise or the assumptions. And yeah, that's usually where most people make their mistakes, is because they're able to add 2 + 2 and find 4, but they didn't realize the first number should have been a 3,
Right.
because they made the mistake in counting in the beginning.
It seems like here it's with the conclusion, though.
Well, maybe, but the argument here is they've each made a mistake in what they think is the justification for why they divide this, right? So their real mistake is in their assumptions, and that's why they are each inconsistent. And the rabbis are pointing out that inconsistency. But in part 2, we're going to see them try to also attack the guy who was consistent, because, no one is left unscathed.
So they said to Rabbi Eliezer,
Oh, just a second. There we go. Yeah.
what reason have you found for dividing your standards? Either pronounce them both impure or pronounce them both pure.
Right? So it's what we've been talking about, is why are you inconsistent? Right? If you really wanted to do this right, shouldn't you be consistent between olive and bone?
He said to them, greater is the impurity of flesh than the impurity of bones. For the defilement of flesh applies both to animal carcasses and to creeping things, but it is not so in the case of bones.
All right. So the first answer that is given is, well, flesh is worse than bones, right? Therefore, flesh can be render something impure, but a tinier piece of bone would not render something impure. That is a logical position. Doesn't mean it's the right one, but it is a logical position if you hold that there's a difference between flesh and bone. However, he gives an additional answer to try and support the idea as well.
Right. Another answer is a limb which has on it the proper quantity of flesh causes impurity by touching and by carrying and by being under the same roof space, the same ohel. If the flesh is diminished, it is still pure, while if the bone is diminished, it is still pure.
No, it is pure, right? The flesh is diminished, it is
still
impure.
That's right. The bone is
Right.
diminished,
It is pure. Right? So his argument as well is that if you had, like, let's say a finger, right, and the flesh begins to rot away, it's still considered to be impure. On the other hand, if the bone removed, then it would be still pure. So therefore, the bone, in his opinion, seems to be more easily ignored, right? Because as the bone goes down, the impurity seems to go down, but as the flesh goes down, the impurity does not seem to be going down. Does that make sense? Again, that doesn't mean that he's right, but at least now we have some understanding of why he splits his decision in favor of calling the flesh more impure causing than the bone.
I thought it was more because of the quantity, it was smaller. But
Well, and so that's what they're trying to unravel, is if it was just about quantity, then there should be some sort of consistency or some declaration about the quantity. But that's not the
That's
route
not
that
the
anyone's
route.
taking. Okay, but Rabbi Nehunya, he gets grilled too, for a second time.
They said to Rabbi Nehunya, what reason have you found for dividing your standards? Either pronounce them both impure or pronounce them both pure.
Okay, so again, why do you split your decision?
He said to them, greater is the impurity of bones than the impurity of flesh. For flesh severed from a living man is pure, whereas a limb severed from him, while in its natural condition, is impure.
Right? So the greater the impure, the bone impurity seems to be stronger than the flesh impurity, because the flesh severed from a living man, right, as opposed to from carcasses or from other dead things, right, does seem to, the flesh severed is pure, but the limb is impure, right? So therefore, the limb, which contains a bone, that must be the bone that's causing the problem. So to go back to my example, his argument is that if I were to cut off part of my ear, I'm not Van Gogh, that would not render the earlobe impure. But if I were to cut off my finger or my hand or my arm, that would be impure. And his argument is, what's the difference? The bone. Therefore, the bone is more impure than the flesh. So chunk of flesh, no problem. Chunk of bone, problem. Makes sense? Within his logic, it makes sense. Okay. But he gives another answer too.
This is part B. Another answer: an olive's quantity of flesh from a corpse causes impurity by touching and by carrying and by being under the same ohel. And a majority of a corpse's bones causes impurity by touching and by carrying and by being under the same ohel. If the flesh is diminished, it's pure. But if a majority of the bones is diminished, although it does not cause impurity by being under the same roof space, it yet causes defilement by touching and by carrying.
All right. So again, the flesh, when being diminished, can eventually no longer be of an issue. But the bone, although it doesn't cause one type of impurity, it does still cause impurity in other ways. Therefore, bone must have more potent impurity, and that's why he ruled what he ruled. Good. Okay, onward.
C. Another answer: any flesh of a corpse less than an olive's quantity is pure, but bones forming the greater portion of the body build, or the greater portion of the number of the corpse's bones, even though they do not fill a quarter kav, are yet impure.
Okay, so if you have the less than olives, everybody agrees that it doesn't transmit impurity. But the bones, if it is less than a quarter kav, if it is still a small amount, but it is bones from the majority of the body, it doesn't matter how much it is, even if it's a smaller amount, it still renders impure.
What's bones from the majority of the body mean?
It means the bones from the actual majority of your bones. Like from like your, if I were to take and have all of your bones, sorry, and then to divide them into two piles, and one pile had the majority and the other had less than the majority would cause impurity, and the less than majority would not. Even if the majority was still less than a quarter kav worth of actual bone matter, right? The fact that it was most of you would make them impure causing, even if it wasn't a lot of bone, right? So he's saying it's not about the amount of bone, it's about what the bone represents. And in his mind, the bone seems to, because of the other rulings, represent the person more than the flesh represents the person. Now, that may be because the bone was the part that was preserved most in antiquity, because the skin rotted away and the bones didn't. But that does seem to be the direction that he's leaning.
But he's not talking about all of your flesh and an olive-sized piece of bone. Somehow he's making it an olive-sized piece of flesh and all of your bones and comparing those two.
Well, not all your bones, right? But bones forming the greater portion of the body's build, right? Or the greater portion of a number of corpses' bones.
Right.
Right? Or, even if there isn't a lot of them. Like, let's imagine, it was a baby, right? It still would render impure.
But if you take enough bones from the big pile, would that count as a third pile?
If you divide, yes, you have the bones scattered, right? Then no single amount of bones is sufficient to cause impurity.
So if there's no majority, just the plurality would still not? Except
he believes that bone, because of this general rule, should always be rendered impure. Right, there we are, down on number N, or letter N. Right, so in his opinion, it should all be rendered impure.
Anything that has a
Any bone, yeah. Because bone seems to be more potent than flesh. whereas Rabbi Eliezer seemed to think that flesh was more potent than bone.
Because of, not even because of the size, it was just the logic.
The inherent quality of the flesh as revealed by other rulings led him to believe that flesh was more potent as an impurifier, as an impurity-causing object, whereas Rabbi Nehunya had exactly the opposite deduction from the same types of other rulings, which implies that the other rulings were not written to consistently extract these particular principles. So this is, again, something we've talked about a few times, which is the Mishnah often avoids stating general principles. And that's precisely because general principles can get you in trouble in special circumstances, or even general circumstances that have a different condition that you didn't notice. And what both of these rabbis are trying to do is draw conclusions based on some of the additional evidence of how else do we handle bones and flesh in different situations. And what the Mishnah is trying to point out is you're drawing from some of the other rulings, but an opponent could draw from some of the other rulings and come to exactly the opposite conclusion. So your general principle is not actually general or a principle. It's just one way of looking at it, and we can't rule just because of that way of looking at it.
On this, I know I try to side with Rabbi Nehunya. For me, for the following way, like corpse, everyone agree is impure, correct?
A corpse?
Yeah,
Yeah.
corpse is impure.
Yeah.
Fine.
Dead body,
Now,
impure.
a corpse has at the beginning skin and bones,
Mhm.
but 10 years after that, the skin disappeared and
Right.
we have bones, and the corpse is still impure.
Right?
That therefore the bones are more important in the impurity to keep the impurity than the skin.
Yeah, but
So that's why I think that Rabbi
well,
Nehunya-
Rabbi Eliezer gave you two very good reasons at the top, right? That the flesh was worse than the impurity of the bones, right? Because the defilement of the flesh is for both animal carcasses and creeping things, but not for bones.
but
Right.
it's more consistent in the long term, a long time in time, the bones than the skin, because the skin disappears, the bones always is there. So it's much stronger as an impurity sources.
Right, but as he points out also in part B at the top, right? A limb which has on it the proper quantity of flesh causes impurity by touching and by carrying and by being under the same roof, the ohel, right? But if the flesh is gone, it is still impure, right? But if the flesh is diminished, it is still impure. While if the bone is diminished, it becomes pure. At a certain point, if the bone there's too little bone, then we no longer consider that to be impure. Now,
So in a cemetery, after 100 years, if you don't put any new corpse, become to be a fine place for Kohanim, because you don't have more corpse, so it's no more impure.
which is why both of them can't. They're not the ruling opinion, right? They each have a piece of the puzzle, and they're each trying to take their pieces of the puzzle and say they know what the rest of the picture looks like. And the Mishnah is saying, no, you're each taking a couple pieces, but you don't have all the pieces. This is why sometimes trying to guess what the answer should be from the information you currently have is problematic. If we were talking about logic earlier, this is the difference between inductive and deductive logic, right? They're both using inductive logic. They have some of the information and they're trying to fill in the blanks. And the Mishnah is saying, but you each only have some of the information. And if you had all of the information, your answer might be different. So better to simply know what you know and not try to imagine more outcomes into areas that you don't know yet, right?
So it's not kind of building a fence.
Well, so in this case, they both think they're building a fence, but their fences are the opposite of each other. So which fence do you pick? Just impure for everything?
No, in a way that to be more conservative, more, let's say, you know what, it's better to know what you know and just rule by you know, and not trying to expand too much because you never know what will happen with other examples you have.
Absolutely. The rabbis are very clear.
Be very conservative.
So this is what's we called shmuah, right? What you have heard, your received information is always supposed to be your strongest information, right? That's why remember we saw at the end of the last chapter when the rabbi said to his son, "I heard it from many teachers. You've only heard it from me. you should change and follow the majority, right? Because you've heard from the majority that it's different than what I heard. So the idea of what you've heard, what you've received, that should be your starting place, your standard. And then from that, yes, you can make some logical deductions into the application, but not into rulings on totally blank areas of your knowledge, right? So I can make an application of, can I do this on Shabbat or can I not do this on Shabbat? Like when, electricity was invented and things like that. But I can't make a new invention of what is prohibited on Shabbat, right? No matter how good my logic is, and no matter how much I think I understand what the Torah said about that and what the rabbi said, I can't just invent some new prohibition on Shabbat and say, this is the 40th malacha that you're not allowed to do. Right? No, it doesn't work, right? Because I did not receive that information. No one has. And therefore I can apply, but I can't generate new positions. And that's what this Mishnah is trying to sort of flesh out for us.
I was gonna say, if we become too specific in our rulings, then they almost become arbitrary if we don't have any general. Because you're talking about the application.
Okay.
In application, you need
Yeah.
you need a principle to apply.
Well, you do in American law, yes. American law loves principles. It's kind of how we were founded. The Declaration of Independence really starts off as setting out principles. And then the Constitution actually does the work of having specifics. The preamble is not binding law. The actual articles of the Constitution are binding law. So principles are good, and they are important as guiding how we understand what answers would be within the normal range of expected answers. But ultimately, principles can't fill in the dark spaces, right? A principle is not a flashlight. It can't add new light. It's the rulings that add light. This is how they followed the law. And this is how we will then follow the law. And the principles will tell us, yes, we're in the right zone and will help inspire us in all sorts of other things, but we can't generate whole new principles without fear of being led off into a corner, unless the principle fits the test, that it fits every single condition and application of the law, which is why if some rabbi shows up and says, your principle sounds interesting, but I remember seeing situation ABC, you have to account for why ABC doesn't break your principle. Now, the Talmud does a lot more of that, and the rabbis do argue about more generic principles, but they are very, very suspicious of general rules. There's an instability in general rules. This is not like physics where we can work out the general rule for gravity, and then we don't have to memorize tables and tables and tables of how fast cannonballs fall, but we can work out one formula. There isn't a single formula that works for these kinds of things.
Right. But they usually, let's say ABC doesn't fit your principles, and we see this in American law too.
Right.
They carve out exceptions to the general rules, and they usually give the reason for the principles, and then when you have an exception, you say why the principles don't apply to these things.
Absolutely, and that is one way the Talmud will often resolve principle challenging exceptions. They'll say, that's very nice, but that's an exception because of this. Or that's very nice, but that doesn't fall under this rule. It's being handled by a different rule, even though you wouldn't have thought it by looking at it. So the Talmud handles that in similar ways,
Right.
but it wants to make sure that the principle is narrowly, bound and not just used as a flamethrower anywhere you want.
But if it's too narrow, it almost becomes arbitrary because you're saying, well, we're going to apply this here, this here, this here, and this here, and there's not enough logic or precedent to justify that, right?
Or doesn't give you enough flexibility.
Right, which is
in
why
situations.
the Jewish law generally tries to strike a balance. It wants learners, especially beginners, to remember the facts, to remember the specific applications, the specific rulings. Because if you remember that, as they say, a broken clock is right twice a day. If you remember the specific rulings, you'll be right at least on those points, right? That at least you can trust. And then you can begin to learn other things that are more advanced and more complicated, but none of them can break those general facts. Whereas in a lot of the modern educational system, we tend to start from general interpretations and why do you think this happened, often without having all the facts. It's one of the things that I found is very frustrating. I'll work with kids, my own included, and they'll be asked to do a history assignment, and they'll often be asked questions about, why did the French Revolution happen? But the chapter did not really give them all the facts. It gave them some of the facts, but it jumped straight into the principles before it got through all of the details. And that's because people don't want to read facts. They don't want to read dates. They don't want to remember names. They don't want to, and that means that oftentimes people will jump to incorrect conclusions because they didn't get all the details. So we memorize the details first, and then we can see the whole picture from all the puzzle pieces.
And that's what led to this problem, though, right? They were looking at the general facts from the rulings they held, and they did inductive reasoning.
Right.
And that's how they got into this problem to begin with.
Because the number of facts they each were bringing to the case was too limited. There was more information, and that more information was available. It existed, and they should have known that. That's partly what the sages are rebuking them for.
How's it possible to know all this stuff?
You come to class, you study.
Right.
Right? That's the whole point, and you have a much better memory than most people do now.
But Rabbi, always the Mishnah, when all the Rabbi have the discussion,
Mm-hmm.
they don't talk about the pasuk from the Torah.
No, that's not
But they discussion on one of the pasuk.
Right.
One of the.
So that's not the Mishnah's job, right? The Mishnah's job is not to prove why this is the ruling from the Torah. That's the Midrash's job, right? So if you read like Midrash Sifra, right, or the Mechilta on the Book of Exodus, right, or Sifrei, if you read the Midrash collections, Midrash Halacha, not the Agadah, but the Halacha, that's where they'll give their, because of this verse, because of that verse, this is what we believe the ruling is. Right, that's where they do the deduction from the original Torah verses. By the time we get to the Mishnah, they're not proving that this is the law. They've already done that in the other book. They're just trying to prove the details of application. So maybe someday when we finish this, we can, maybe when we get to Exodus next year, we could bring out the Mechilta and go through that, parasha by parasha to see how the rabbis do it. I think there's a good translation of the Mechilta. I don't know if it's online like this one though. Probably not public domain.
How do you spell pizza?
Mem Chaf Lamed Taf Aleph.
Use Lamed Taf.
Yeah.
Aleph.
Mechilta. Yeah.
Chilta.
Aleph.
Taf Aleph at the end. Yeah.
Torah to connect.
Now, if you're reading in the Hebrew, you can find the Mechilta online. Actually, there might be one public domain. Sefaria might have an English translation of the Mechilta that we could use if people wanted to do that at some point. We wouldn't even have to do it according to the parasha, because sometimes one parasha takes longer than another. If there's interest, we can talk about seeing how Midrash Halacha works to bring out the law from the original text. That might be interesting to do. Mechilta. Yeah, but that's only for the book of Shemot. Right, that's only for the book of Exodus. Yeah.
And the rest?
So there's Sifra for Leviticus. There's Sifrei for Devarim. Yeah. What did you want? One book?
Yeah. Well, it's a first budget.
Yeah.
To see.
Well, and that's how it works.
So,
All right. Let's go ahead and hit number 3. Finally, Rabbi Joshua gets a little time in the sun.
So they said to Rabbi Joshua, "What reason have you found for pronouncing them both pure?"
How dare you be consistent?
He said to them, "No, when you pronounce impure in the case of a corpse, it's because the rules of majority, the quarter kaf, and decayed matter apply to it. But how can you say the same of a living man, seeing that the rules of majority, quarter kaf, and decayed matter do not apply to him?"
Okay. So Rabbi Joshua says no. What he's basically saying is all of the opinions that were just given, I don't agree with. Right? All of those other explanations that Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Nehunya gave, no, I don't agree with those. Why? Because fundamentally, here's a principle, right? Fundamentally, you can't draw a tight analogy between a corpse and a living person. Right? There are going to be some rules that apply to corpses and some rules that apply to living people. And if you think that because this is how it works with a body, this is how it will work with a living person, or this is how it works with a living, therefore it works with a body. If you try doing that, then you're going to be mistaken. And then he tries to explain, right? because in the case of a corpse, right, it is because of the rule of the majority, right, the sense of the quarter ka, the decayed matter, all those have applied to it. But with a living man, right, we don't use those same rules. And therefore, you can't draw a one-to-one comparison in order to say that what happens with the body happens with the living flesh. And therefore, the living flesh taken from a human being, he says, pure, pure. Oh, sorry, pure. I mean, Rabbi Eliezer agrees, but for a different reason, right?
So the general rule is basically no general rules?
You got it.
Until proven otherwise. Right? The hardest thing to do in any Jewish subject is to find a general rule, because there will always be exceptions, and often those exceptions are earth-shattering. So yeah, there are no exceptions there's no rule without exceptions, except for when there are rules without exceptions. There's no exceptions to any rule except for this one. Or there are exceptions to every rule except for this one.
Well, that's because we don't have one person who's totally infallible who will tell us what exactly the right thing is. We accept all opinions and consider them.
Well,
Because
yes.
we don't have also all the facts. in
Yes.
life.
But we may have more, someday we have more
But
facts.
so what you're talking about is the difficulty of application, right? Which is when I go to apply a particular mitzvah, right? I don't have all the information. You know, give a classic example when I need to give tzedakah, right? And I got two people who come to my house simultaneously, right? And they both seem to be in equal circumstances, right? Same gender, same request, same need. How do I make my decision between one and the other? And there isn't a way to be sure I'm giving to the right person. And that's because we are limited in our ability to analyze the situation and to get the information. But theoretically, if I had all the information, I could make the right decision. That's at least in theory.
Yes.
What Harriet's talking about is the basic idea of, is there a principle for who I give preference to for tzedakah? That's not necessary you don't need more information to answer that. You need a clearer understanding of Torah, right? And that we have all the information, right? The Torah is not going to get any bigger. It's not going to get any smaller, right? We got all the words. It's a question of how well we understand it. And that is something that theoretically we can't do, right? Theoretically, there's no way to be 100% absolutely sure that every analysis of the Torah that you're making is 100% true. It's like, one of those graphs where you can get as close to 100 as you want, but you're still going to be at 99.9999999.
It's like going with an asymptote.
For what?
Asymptote.
Symptom?
Yeah, asymptote in math.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. It's back in algebra, right? It's okay. It's just I'm in a different corner of my brain. It's been 30 years since I had to do
I was
that.
learning rational functions.
Thankfully, I helped my daughter recently,
was
or
an
not recently, but
isotope
in middle
you
school
said?
for that. So
Yeah, like a vertical asymptote.
Is it horizontal isotope? Huh?
isotope is chemistry, but yeah, you approach the target, but you never quite reach it.
Exactly.
And our certainty factor is always approaching. As Sarah pointed out, no one's infallible, right? There's no sage that has a perfect grasp of all of this, even back in the day. But we do the best that we can to analyze their understanding and base it off their best understanding. And that brings us closer and closer and closer. And God never tells us we need to be perfect. He just seems to say we need to be striving for as best an understanding as we can get and not just giving up. We don't give up and we don't say we're already done.
So why, let's say that Joshua was right.
Right.
Okay. He's consistent. He said, no, you cannot do a comparison. So why he choose pure and pure and not impure and pure?
Because there's no reason in his mind of why a living body's pieces that are of minute quantity should cause impurity. There's no justification for saying that it would, right? So again, we've been trained in the modern world, last 200 years, think that if you're not sure, say no. Right, that was the great reactionaryism, the counter-revolutionary motto of orthodoxy when it began, right? Which was, if you're not sure, forbid. That wasn't historically the Jewish position. Historically, the Jewish position was, if you want to forbid, you have to prove it, right? Everything in life is permitted until we see some reason to forbid it. That's the default position of the world, right? Every action, every behavior, every food is permitted until the Torah tells us no. Once the Torah tells us no, then no more bacon. Fine, right? But it comes as
everything is positive until someone
absolutely
proves the contrary.
Absolutely, it's the same way. It's the same principle in a court of law for claimants, right? For two people who are arguing. If I say you owe me money, you don't have to prove you don't. I have to prove you do, because I'm the one coming to make a new obligation. So I'm the one who has to prove it. So that means that if I don't have proof that it's forbidden, I can't forbid it. And again, I know that sounds weird to the modern mind because of the counter-revolutionary, reactionary position of orthodoxy in the contemporary world, which people somehow still imagine is the original Judaism, which it isn't. Right? It's no more original than the conservative movement or the reform movement. Right? All three of us are reactions to what happened with the Enlightenment. Right? It changed our communities fundamentally, and we're all trying to figure out how to live after that. Each have chosen.
This is a reaction to the Enlightenment?
Yes. Yeah, we're still figuring it out 200 years later.
But that was, there was no Enlightenment in the Middle East, though, was there?
Well, no. And in fact, there wasn't an Enlightenment officially in the Middle East. And that's one reason why, until the encounter with Jews from the West, there weren't these types of issues in terms of stringency versus leniency as being value judgments. If you went back 100 years and you visited somebody in Baghdad, or you visited someone in Yemen, or visited someone in Egypt, a Jewish rabbi, they weren't talking about humras and that rabbi's too makil or things. That they were just doing what Judaism had done for 2,000 years, which was do the best they could to understand the law as it applied to their community in keeping with precedent and tradition. And they weren't defending tradition against modernity. They were just defending the tradition. It wasn't war, it was life. And that produced a very different type of halakha. That's why even to this day, if you read through many of the rulings of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, it sounds really, really lenient compared to a lot of the rulings of European Jews. As I like to point out, he's more lenient in how to use a dishwasher as far as kashrut goes than I am, because he was raised with a different set of basic principles, and the principles that I learned first, and I remain true to my teachers, are stricter in some of those ways.
So to make their life easier for the congregants also.
But it wasn't trying to make life easier or trying to make life stricter. It was what was his, or what is the rabbi's honest understanding of the law as he has received it, right? And if it said, be strict on this, then you were strict. And if it said, be lenient on this, you were lenient. You just followed the way you felt the law was going. And yes, considerations of what the community was able to uphold and what the community needed spiritually, that played into it all. Again, if you're interested, read Rabbi Joel Roth's The Halachic Process for how halakha worked for most of our history, as opposed to how it became the tool of different political movements. But yes, that was sort of the more natural way. Now, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef became very political, and the Sephardim and the Mizrahim have become more like the ultra-Orthodox European Jews over the last 50 years from where they were originally. That's why you'll see many Sephardim wearing fedoras now.
But the reason is because in Israel they went to Lithuanian yeshivas to study. So they study all the Torah from the rabbi from the Lithuania.
And that has changed things
the philosophy.
hugely.
Yeah, that's the reason.
Right? Their native original traditions and shita, English, their style, has almost been lost in many of the observant Sephardic communities. It's a real shame. And of course, within the secular Sephardic communities, it's lost as well.
In some generation, they had a problem between the young,
the
generation that came now from yeshiva, from Lithuania, with the oldest one. They come from the Sephardic school, That they have a different way to see the reality.
Yes. Yeah, the philosophy has changed dramatically because of that mixture in Israel and the overlap of the communities and of the way the institutions have cooperated to work on shared ideas, of what they thought Shabbat should be like or what they thought kashrut in the country should be like. That has brought them a lot closer, but it's brought the Sephardim much closer to the Ashkenazim than it moved the Ashkenazim towards the Sephardim. Right? The Sephardim are the ones who have gravitated more than the other way around. All right.
I think that, I don't know, but I always say, I think that it will affect you in Israel, the army. When the army is presented and say, yes, Safed and Safed.
Yeah.
You are not sure, just reject. Okay, don't think twice, correct? In everything. So that affects you because you start thinking that way. Okay, I'm not sure about this, if it's kosher or not, just to go to
right in that zone, but that doesn't mean you take it with you everywhere you go. That's one of the hardest parts of human society to really understand and live with, is that, yes, this is the right behavior in this setting, but when I walk out that door, I need a different set of behaviors.
Because the perspective that you were explaining until now is more positive, the approach, than what is today, the Judaism becomes really more negative.
Within certain movements,
yeah.
Right? I mean, but the
because
problem...
I think is when you say, you can everything until someone prove the opposite. And say the opposite. Say,
right.
Okay, means give you the opportunity to try to be more open-minded, to be more open to new things.
Right.
But if you say, no, you cannot do anything, you can't not anything new until someone tell you, what, it's okay, you already start from the negative side.
Right. You start inside the cage.
Anything new.
Right. There's a beautiful line, and we'll finish with this because it's topical, and I love finishing with Talmud, where it says, when we die and we stand before the throne for judgment, one of the things God will say to us is, of all the things that were permitted in this world to you and that you had the opportunity to enjoy, that you chose not to, why? Explain yourself. Why didn't you enjoy my world to its fullest? Right? God will demand from us of why we neglected his gift. God gave us so much that we could enjoy that was permitted, and so much opportunity to enjoy it, especially now in the 21st century, especially those of us living in this country. How do we explain to God of why we didn't want to enjoy his world?
It's easy. Maybe a fear of him.
No, that's not fear.
Yes, you're afraid to do something incorrectly in the eyes of God, so you play safe.
Your most honored, noble father, friend, president of the country, whatever, whoever you respect most in the world, gives you a present, right? It's beautifully wrapped. Do you choose not to open it because you might break it? Do you just leave it on the shelf? Right?
My mom does this. She was
she's probably not watching. Right. So there's a midrash of a king who has two servants, like ministers, and he gives both of them wheat, and one of them takes the wheat home and just keeps it, and the other takes the wheat home and grinds it up and bakes it into bread, and then the king calls them both back. And the one hands the king the wheat, and the other hands the king the bread. And the king obviously prefers the person who did the bread, right? The guy who gave the wheat says, how could you break and destroy the king's gift, right? And burn it and cook it. It's terrible. And the king says, no, this is what I want.
This is a very Marxist explanation of the midrash.
What? That you're supposed to transform the world?
Yeah. To add the value to the original one.
That's not Marxism. That's life. God does not want us to live through this life and die the same as we were born, right? We are meant to transform our neshama, our soul, as we go through this life, and we transform it through experiences, not by hiding in the corner. And so if we ignore those experiences, if we ignore those opportunities, then we are, it's based on we are spitting in the face of God and saying, I'd rather not be alive because maybe I'll do something wrong. Right? That is not what God called us into existence for. And with that, we'll call it a night. And we finished chapter 6.
Robert, that's like one of the main prayers in the Cedars, right? Where it said God loves